That's a real challenge. So all these things kind of come together, and you're sort of looking at it like, wow, this is an industry that is completely ripe for disruption.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you look at it from the perspective of the customer being parents and students, they are stepping back, and it's been going on for a while, evaluating the tuition versus value equation. And a lot of them are seeing that, tuition has gone up since 1980, like 170%. But the salary of a college graduate has only gone up about 19-20%.
So here we go, Rhonda. We're going to talk all about education, maybe with a bit of an emphasis on higher education today. And it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on what makes this an interesting topic at this time.
Well, for me, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. As you know, I'm a member of the board of a charter management organization called Uncommon Schools that operates 55 schools. We serve 20,000 scholars in New York, New Jersey, and in Boston. I think our school total, yeah, I said 55, but and we're all focused, our mission is really focused on getting our scholars to and through college. And our population of students is really low income students. So we're really catering to that hard to reach student who typically would not go to college. And how do we get them to and through college?
Okay, so that's great background just to give us a bit of an anchor on your experience in this topic area. For my part, aside from the fact that my partner is a teacher, I've done a ton of work in higher education and primary education over the years in a consulting capacity, and more recently in my sort of night job as chair of ADHD Australia, we've been doing a lot of work mapping the journeys of primary, secondary, and tertiary education to help
Hmm.
better serve neurodivergent individuals in the education setting. So it's been really interesting to explore it from that perspective as well. But today, what we're going to do is talk about the system, aren't we? So why don't you
Right.
kick off and give us a sense of like what are some of the big triggers that give us um, a sense that we're moving forward or backwards in education, and how do we tie that back to the insurgent mindset?
Yeah, well, if you're thinking about it from a K through 12 perspective, the challenge, at least in the population that Uncommon School serves, has been that, students are coming into our schools underprepared. They're low-income neighborhoods, so they don't have the kinds of resources and support that other neighborhoods might have. So we have a lot of work to get students up to speed so that they can be prepared to go off to college and complete college. But the pandemic created a real challenge for us because prior to the pandemic, we were really doing very well in terms of closing the achievement gap between our population and the what we call the non-economically disadvantaged population. But because of the pandemic and the school closures, we had learning loss, and not just at Uncommon, it was significant learning loss in this population of low income students and students across the board. But I think the low income students and students in low income neighborhoods suffered more and have a larger gap to close because of the pandemic. And we've sort of made a lot of progress, but there's more room and for us to close that achievement gap. And then the other challenge that we have is, again, our mission has always been about college and getting students through to and through college. But now with all the forces um, pressing up against the higher education space, it's making the challenge of college and getting them to and through college even harder. And I think that that's really what I wanted to talk about is how is higher education being disrupted and being, the forces that are really creating challenges for people to just say yes the way that they did when I was ready to go off to college. It was like a given. We were all thinking about who was going to college. And interesting data I saw the other day said that when you think about the 80s and when men and women were going off to school, they were going at about equal rates. But if you look at it now, there's about a 10 to 12% gap between the percentage of women that complete college and the percentage of males that complete college. So there are a lot of factors that come into play. It's, in addition to just, the percentage of men that decide to go to college. And so I wanted to sort of put that on the table and maybe we can talk about that.
Okay, terrific. And for me, here we are I'm in Sydney, Australia today, and the New South Wales high school system just finished the HSC, which is Higher School Certificate, earlier this week. So it's kind of a timely opportunity, I think, to talk about education and the role of education in terms of particularly that transition between, primary school and university. So let's talk a little bit about the background, though. I think it's really interesting to kind of unpack what I would describe as a broad mix of systemic challenges that are
Mhm.
sort of setting the table for disruption in education. And I think let's start with the customer, as we tend to do in terms of you know fundamentally. One thing I think is really interesting is on the demand side, employers, which are typically businesses, institutions, and so forth. The change in this environment is so rapid in so many industries. A big question for me is whether or not education is able to keep up with this change, given the relatively long gestation of the education system to mint
Mhm.
new employees into the system. So to me, I think that's a really interesting thing. I think there's also major changes to be discussed in terms of the role of technology, AI, for example, and how that plays a role on demand side and supply side. You might remember we had an intern working here last summer where it was fun to watch her come into to the firm to take on a new assignments. And it was interesting that she was resistant, for example, to use AI because in the university setting, they told her
Right,
that's plagiarism,
right,
right? So I think there's a really interesting sort of phenomenon there to talk about. And then I think on the supply side, there's a lot of issues that start very early, to your point about demographic change. Super important in North America, probably also in Australia. We're not minting enough new people, for one thing. So
right.
there's a bit of a supply constraint of new candidates to enter university. But at the same time, supply of, let's call it course units, is, I think, really mismatched with what the needs are on the demand side for skills. So
Right.
that mismatch creates a situation where we've got massive polarization, not a political polarization, but let's call it course polarization, where a very small number of courses have a very high return on investment, and a relatively large chunk of other courses have a low ROI, and students seem to be getting disillusioned and potentially looking at other options.
Hmm.
And if we add all that to just the massive cost
Mm.
of higher education, which is a burden for virtually everybody in the system, particularly if you have a negative ROI sort of course, that's a real challenge. So all these things kind of come together, and you're sort of looking at it like, wow, this is an industry that is completely ripe for disruption.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you look at it from the perspective of the customer being parents and students, they are stepping back, and it's been going on for a while, evaluating the tuition versus value equation. And a lot of them are seeing that, tuition has gone up since 1980, like 170%. But the salary of a college graduate has only gone up about 19-20% over that time. But meanwhile, they're taking on lots of debt. And I think people are stepping back and saying, whoa, is the value really there? I think that higher education spent a lot of time focusing on graduation. And what they need to be thinking about is the value proposition of the economic mobility that a student will achieve from getting his or her college degree. They need to be able to focus on the outcomes such as, the ability to land a good paying job that will pay enough to sort of cover some of the debt that they're going to have to pay back over time. And I think that's what's happening. There's a disconnect between what higher education is communicating as the value and what potential buyers, the parents and students, are looking for now, to some of your points, right? Unless you are in some of the STEM degrees, or you're heading off into consulting and areas like that, the challenge is, are you going to make enough money to be able to pay off these big student loan debts? And on average, students are taking out $40,000 to get through college. $40,000 of debt. You tack on the interest and you're paying that for 10, 15 years. It becomes, an onerous, challenge for some people. And they go, wow, is the value really there for me? So I think higher education has a real opportunity to rethink how it communicates its value to potential parents and students.
Okay, but it's fair to say that not all degree programs are negative ROI, right? So
No,
it's a combination of factors. I mean, overall, university is positive ROI, right? But there are certainly, as we talked about just now, course programs that are deeply negative, and I think it sort of depends on a number of different variables, right? So what you study is really important. So your point, if you're studying in STEM or maybe nursing, for
right,
example, even accounting, where there's a shortage of newly minted accountants. If you're studying business and studying to be a business analyst,
right.
all these are going to be really strong ROI. But the humanities are definitely struggling in terms of ROI, and that's really a bit of a shame. But I think that's one factor, and then another factor, obviously, is where you study. Well, that
Mhm.
doesn't appear to be as important in terms of, for example, the quality of the university, or the brand ranking of those universities, so much as the more expensive and the higher brand universities tend to have much higher graduation rates, which is
Right.
the almost the highest, the most important variable in terms of the ROI. So the
Yes.
higher, or at a university level, um, the higher graduation rate is, the higher the ROI the student will achieve. So it's super strongly correlated.
Right. What's interesting though is what Uncommon has been really successful at doing is matching our students to the right kinds of schools. Like they really help our students to stretch for the higher kinds of level of school that they can stretch to. And to your point, the more highly selective schools, those schools that have 99, 100% college graduation rate in 6 years, we see that our kids who go to those schools, they graduate. So they sort of follow the norm. And we try to position our kids to get to schools where they have higher college graduation rates. And in addition, what you may not know is that in the United States, those low-income kids who get into those very selective schools oftentimes get a lot of financial aid. So they're not leaving the schools with a lot of debt, if any debt. It's the ones who are not able to get into those very selective schools that are taking on more debt. And they are the ones who are more at risk, probably, of not completing that degree because they're maybe in a school where the graduation rate is a little lower. They're paying more for that school, so they're taking on more student loan debt. So that causes a lot more complications for them and stress. And maybe the tendency is to say, hey, I need to step back and I need to work for a while, or what have you. And that sort of gets them sort of get offline for a while in terms of college.
Rondo, I can't help but wonder, since you've given the example of Uncommon, I can't help but wonder, does your organization tend to stay with students through to graduation from university,
That's
or you hand them over and and then they're off on their own? Just a question.
It's a great question. No, we do. We do. We actually have a core, a team of college advisors. Once our kids go off to school, there's a handoff from the college guidance counselor from the high school to the college support team that supports our alum who are actively in college. And that's all from helping them, in their first couple of years set up their goals and objectives and their plan and determine what courses they're going to take, to helping those who are, may have stepped off and are thinking about coming back in, or encouraging them to get back on and complete their college degree. So our big challenge is to get out, like I said, get our students to and through college. And for our population of students, we have most of them come from low income neighborhoods. we have a 51% graduation rate from four-year colleges in a 6-year period. And then we have what we call a college persistence rate, which is, the students who are actively in college or have graduated from college for a period of time. And that's, I think we spoke about it, it's like 57%. And again, our target is always to, at least hit the benchmark of, non-economically disadvantaged students as well, which is hovering around 59% for graduation from a four-year college. And so, yes, we have that, and we've been intensifying our efforts around college support, trying to figure out what else could we be doing to help our students to stay in, so we can move that four-year graduation rate up from the 51% to the 60%.
All right, let's zoom back a little bit. And so, Rondo, a question that's on my mind is the education system improving and delivering better results than it was, say, a decade ago? That's question one. And is it evolving and changing with all these cultural, technological, and other dynamics that are affecting all other industries? And what's the playbook, if you will, for education institutions on one hand, students on another, and employers on another, to start thinking differently about education? And maybe what are some of the green shoots that we're seeing in this area?
Yeah, so if I'm responding to that question from perspective of higher education, first I want to say that you mentioned that, it's some colleges are succeeding in delivering the value. But when you look at it in terms of in the United States, we've had 100 schools, universities close since I think 2016. And these are smaller colleges, small liberal arts colleges, regional colleges. They're not able to withstand some of the challenges and disruption happening in the industry. One, because they don't have the resources to invest in the technology, and they need to invest in digital online capabilities, because that is really where I think the education model is shifting in a lot of ways to be more of a hybrid model of education, where you have opportunities for that campus connection or in-person connection, but you also have the flexibility of online. And when you look at universities like Arizona State University, you look at Purdue's global program, Southern New Hampshire University, which has 150,000 students online around the world. Those are the models that are being more disruptive in the higher education space, as well as when you think about the micro-credentialing. So I think that there's a phenomenon of unbundling college right now. So I think we used to think of the goal would be get the college degree. There are some who are saying, what I really need to get, to your earlier point, are the skills to be successful in my job. Employers are even looking at their various job descriptions and saying, do we really need a person with a college degree, or do we need these kinds of skills? And so you have organizations popping up that are helping people to, get these credentials, Minerva, Coursera, lots of courses online, and they're ecosystems. So unlike the traditional higher education, they're not trying to control the whole ecosystem. They bring in partners, all these universities, to bring in the content that they need to provide to their students. I've actually taken a number of different Coursera courses. I love them because you can go at your own pace. There are lots of interesting topics, and there's so many different universities. I've taken courses with Stanford University. I've taken courses with Wharton, online there. So there's a lot, I think, that people are looking at higher education and their ability to get credentials differently. And I think another data point is that people are thinking about not just go the traditional way. You go to high school in the United States, you go to college, you get a job, and you work. We're thinking about, how do you become a lifelong learner, which means that you're always looking to upskill and upgrade your skills. And so these kinds of programs become more important. So then now you think about the college degree and you say, hey, do I really need to get it all right now? Or can I, if I need to, start working, take certificate classes, get certifications, and build over time? because you are trying to think about lifetime learning.
And presumably, Rondo, the cost per unit of education is much lower in an unbundled sort of sense, right? So
Absolutely.
much of what you're paying for in a degree program is the curation of a course program on one hand, the brand on the other, and potentially also the faculty, right? So
Right.
if that becomes unbundled, uh, the cost per unit of education goes down, but still ultimately the asset that kind of is precipitated out of the university program is the degree. So to your
Right.
point, the employers see the degree as potentially less valuable than the skill set. That creates a massively disruptive scenario for education institutions. Now we're already seeing that. I think your point about some of the mid-tier or lower tier universities not being able to keep up with technology is partly a function of this dynamic as well, where these brands who aren't as quite as flexible, traditional incumbent mindset, trying to hold on to what might be a 150-year-old sort of construct, which
Right.
then now in this environment where there's more choice and students have more control perhaps than they've ever had before, this is driving a big shift. And for my part, I think if I was advising a client in a mid-tier university, it would be really you need to be worried because these dynamics are changing very quickly. And my overwhelming experience working with universities is that these are very cumbersome, slow-moving institutions that
Right.
are not sort of programmatically set up to accept and respond to dynamic changes in the market environment at all, right? So not only that, the cycle time of creating new students is very long
Right.
relative to change in the market environment. I was thinking this morning before we started this podcast, um, we really only had mass adoption of AI in the last 18 to 24 months, which is halfway through a university cycle. Who's minting these AI graduates who are needed on the ground right now? Most of these people who are, quote unquote experts in this area are, largely training themselves or
Right.
they're learning in a micro learning environment, which is, I think, kind of indicative of where we're heading with some of this stuff.
The way I was reading something the other day and it made me think of, when you think about the traditional higher education, it's more like blockbusters. And when you think of the sort of the newer insurgent organizations coming in, these platforms, they're thinking about ecosystems, they're more like a Netflix, right? Where you can get things a la carte as you need, as opposed to you have to go to this university setting, physical setting in order to get your education. And I think, I believe that more of this sort of ecosystem mindset is going to continue to proliferate through higher education because I think that it needs, to your point, the leveraging of technology, the need to be more agile is going to be ever present as we move forward.
Okay. So then as we look at this sort of landscape, how might we project what the future of education might look like a decade from now, for example?
That's a great question. It's a great question. I do think that the pendulum is going to continue to shift toward more credentialing and thinking about education as a lifelong learning endeavor, as opposed to just, I've got my 4-year degree, I'm done, or I'm going to get another graduate degree, I'm done. Like that model, I think is not going to be sustainable over the long term, particularly if the cost equation is such that, people have to go further and further into debt because I think more people are going to resist spending that kind of money unless they can, they're fortunate enough in that their employer will cover some of their education costs. I think people will certainly go for it. But if they have to pay for it, I think people are being very deliberate with how they spend their dollars toward education. And I'm seeing a lot more people in my network who are looking at online learning. In fact, I mean, even considering whether college is for them. I have a nephew who is a bright young man, and he's saying, "Hey, I don't know if I want to go to college right now." He started his own little online business. He's feeling successful and feeling creative, and he wants to do that for a while before and deciding what his next move will be. And this is a kid who's like the top of his class. He's doing very well, but he's looking at it and saying, "I'm not sure that I'm ready." It's so I think for me, it's like whereas we would say that's the logical next step, and you keep moving. There are people, parents and students who are starting to pause and not necessarily just make that decision right away to go to college. And some are saying, "Hey, I'm going to take a course and get a credential. I'm going to get certified." Or some are saying, "I want to learn a trade." So I think that we have to really think about pathways at some point because there are going to be colleges going to be still be right for a lot of people, but there are going to be others that, maybe college is not at least out the gate the right next step for them, and we need to help provide them with options as well so that they can continue to be successful.
Right. I think it's all very interesting. So, for my part, if we project 10 years out, I think first that micro-learning trend will continue. That unbundling that you mentioned, I think will bleed into more and more parts of the economy, at least from an education demand point of view, for
Hmm.
sure. But there are still going to be barriers in medicine, for example, in engineering, in accounting, where the credentialing of these individuals is so deeply ingrained in how these industries work. It's going to take a relatively long time to unstitch them. But for example, I think market forces will drive some of this, maybe a little bit more difficult in medicine. But for example, if we look at accounting, a newly minted accountant might average, at least in this economy, maybe 50 or $60,000 a year. But a young person with those same skills can trade at 150K per year as a business analyst, for example. So
Hmm.
that opportunity cost of being in one area or another. Now, I know in North America, or at least in the US, there's a stigma against trades. Here, it's
Right.
a little bit different, a much more constrained labor force. And there are um, apprenticeship programs, which are 4, 5, 6 years to be an electrician or a plumber or a mechanic or whatever. These are serious programs which take a relatively long period of time, almost in some cases the same period of time to get through an apprenticeship as to become a doctor, for example.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
lifetime earnings in Australia, for example, of a plumber compared to a general practitioner in medicine, they're pretty comparable. So I think there's other options for students, particularly as
Right.
that stigma changes as well. And we have those challenges with the, labor supply and demand. So I think that's one thing. I think the second thing, to your point about these ecosystems, the idea of the monolithic university, I think that's going to start to go away. We're going to start to see much more um, where ecosystem not where these higher education businesses look more like platforms
Right.
where they're plugging lots of different capabilities onto those platforms and
Hmm.
students can come in and out, to your point, lifelong learning or other, where this is increasingly happening where individuals at university or college might be studying simultaneously in 4 or 5 different programs from 4 or 5 different universities. That could be study abroad or taking a course from a partner university or micro-learning, whatever. So
Right.
I think that's going to be a key factor too. And, ultimately it's sort of innovate or die. These institutions, without being able to create this flexibility,
Right.
I think what we'll start to see is a pretty significant consolidation at the lower end of the pyramid. A lot of these will go away. Others will consolidate, for example, into, you mentioned ASU earlier, Arizona State University.
Yeah.
Um, you know, we'll get
Purdue.
bigger institutions that are, offering a much more diversified kind of education experience. So I think there's a lot to happen here, but fundamentally, those university officers or the executives of these universities have to kind of work back from what's the demand for labor going to look like and how can universities meet the needs. But I think it's also interesting well, I didn't mention this before, but I think it's interesting that education, health, and construction are the three lowest productivity sectors on the planet. So,
Oh,
and particularly like if you look from 1950 to say 2015, these sectors have not really innovated from a productivity point of view. And then to your point, we're seeing a decline in ROI. These two things have to converge at some point where low productivity and low ROI will drive people to seek alternative options, which
yeah.
means that if we don't adopt the insurgent mindset in higher education, we're going to see a situation that's potentially unrecognizable in a decade or more.
The other
Anyway,
thing
one more.
on my mind is how do we, when you look at the higher ed executive, right, the leader of higher ed, that person needs to have that insurgent mindset. And one of the things that I think that needs to happen is the CEO, college presidents needs to recognize that they don't have all the answers and they need to bring in expertise. So they need to unbundle some of their responsibilities and bring in experts and specialists in areas that can really help the organization. Because I think that, the turnover, that's another big issue within higher education. You have, leadership, CEO tenure or president tenure went from, I think, 8 years a few years ago it's down to like six years now. And then
What's driving that, Rhonda? What's driving that shift?
I think it's a combination. It's the pressures because of the, increased pressure from the public around the ROI on education. It's the political environment here in the US, around colleges and, what kind of, environment that or indoctrination is happening in some of these liberal arts colleges. So they're feeling that pressure. So you're getting a lot of very talented executives who might in the past have gone into university who are not. So they are really even struggling to find talented leaders in higher education, in addition to trying to keep the ones that they have. So I think that that's another pretty disruptive event that's happening in higher education that not a lot of people are talking about.
Well, and to your point, you can rent rather than buying those resources, right? So,
Right,
in some ways, I guess if we project the future, the value of the university brand may diminish in favor of the value of content creator brands. So, great teachers will draw great students, and as we disaggregate the education system,
Mm,
those individuals may play a more of a stronger role where, you know, um, the great the great engineering professor who everybody wants to learn from can syndicate that capability across multiple universities, even multiple geographies simultaneously, which then creates a situation where individuals wanting to study engineering will bring together the best of those people at the
right.
expense, maybe a traditional educational construct.
And that's part of the draw of platforms like edX and Coursera, because exactly what you're saying. You hear about a professor, they're rated, you can see the reviews, you take that course, you review them, so you know who are the rock star professors and the rock star courses, and those are the ones that you gravitate toward. So I could see that happen pretty easily in that space.
And one thing we haven't talked about, and mindful of time here, Rondo, is the feedstock for universities is obviously primary and secondary education. So there's a lot of change happening there too, and a lot of it's social change driven by technology. COVID obviously played a key role in that. But I wonder, and I think this is a question to ponder maybe in a future podcast, is are primary and secondary students prepared for this type of learning? And are
Mm.
they coming into the university system ready? Are they more ready than they were 5 years, 10 years ago? Or are they less ready? Are these social changes, significant enough where these individuals are, fully prepared and kind of equipped with critical thinking and other things that they need to enter university, but at the same time, what their own self-directed learning happens every day through YouTube and TikTok and other platforms. That's how these individuals are used to interacting with the world. And then they go into uh, a university environment which is extremely rigid and extremely programmed which is
Right.
something that probably is a clash for this cohort of young people coming into the university system. It's a theory, not a fact, but I think that these changes will play a role also in terms of how universities need to deal with the incoming supply of students.
Well, it's interesting. Interesting side note. I'm gonna get this wrong, but I think the article said that, I don't know if it was of Ivy League universities or specific ones, but they said that the incoming class of Ivy League students had only read one book in the year, and one full book.
That's a worry.
That was a worry. So you have these new Ivy League, undergraduates who haven't really read a book from cover to cover. So yeah,
Mm,
we are having, I think we have here a situation where we have, at least in a university setting, you have some great inflation. Everybody gets an A, they want an A. You get professors get pushback if they're giving a student a B, forget about a C. They get a lot of pushback. So I think we also have the issue of grade inflation in colleges. So I think that's another reason why the credentialing and skills development, micro-credentialing, that those things are becoming so much more important as well.
right. So I think that the takeaway here is all this change that's affecting, upstream and downstream employers and primary education on one end, universities sort of in the middle. All this change creates a situation where, education is largely going to be unrecognizable a decade from now. And I think if you're a leader of one of these institutions, you need to be thinking very deeply about how to reprogram value in the education environment.
Absolutely. Rethink the value proposition.
Very good. Well, thank you, Rondo, and I look forward to seeing our next go around.
Likewise, Matt, great chatting as always.
All right, then. Have a good one. Talk soon.
Bye-bye.